I had just backed my truck into the gravel driveway of our family's lake cabin when I saw her Karen Whitmore, the self-appointed queen of the Whispering Pines HOA, marching toward me like she owned the entire shoreline. "Excuse me," she snapped, already pulling out her phone. "You can't do that here." I killed the engine and stepped out, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Do what?" I asked, even though I already knew. The moment she saw the storage trailer, her eyes nearly popped out of her head. "This is unauthorized moving activity." "You need HOA approval for large deliveries," she barked, tapping frantically on her phone screen. "My son's being deployed to Kuwait. I'm storing his stuff here at our cabin. Not that I need your permission for that," I said, lifting the trailer door. Karen gasped like I'd just confessed to arson. "Military or not, this is private property governed by HOA rules. You're disrupting the neighborhood." Behind me, the flag on the front porch flapped in the breeze. My son, Curtis, had bought the flagpole himself before shipping out. He loved this place. It was our getaway, quiet, peaceful, and far from the HOA nonsense we dealt with in the city, or so I thought. "I've lived here longer than you've been bossing people around," I said, yanking a box labeled Curtis Gear from the trailer. "You don't get to dictate what I do on my land." "Oh, you'll regret that," she said, dialing. "I'm calling the sheriff." "You're calling 911 on a veteran's father for moving boxes?" I asked, stunned. "I'm calling because this is a violation of HOA Code 3B, no commercial or excessive moving activity without board notice. And you're threatening me." "Lady, I've said like 10 words to you," I said, walking past her with the box. "You're not even worth raising my voice over." She stayed on the phone, pacing in her ridiculous wedge sandals like she was coordinating a SWAT team. And sure enough, 20 minutes later, a deputy cruiser pulled up. The officer stepped out, clearly annoyed. "We got a call about a disturbance." Before I could open my mouth, Karen launched into her performance. "He's unloading unauthorized materials, he's aggressive, and he refused to comply with HOA regulations." The deputy turned to me. "Sir, can I ask what you're doing?" "Storing my son's belongings," I said, handing him a copy of Curtis's deployment orders. "He's Army. Got shipped out this week. This is our family cabin, no laws broken here." The deputy looked at the papers, nodded, then glanced at Karen. "Ma'am, this isn't a criminal matter. You wasted our time." Karen's face flushed red. "But the HOA isn't the law," the deputy said flatly. "And calling 911 for this, that's abuse of emergency services." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The deputy gave me a nod, then drove off. I turned back to the trailer, heart pounding but hands steady. I'd let it go if it ended there. But the next morning, I woke up to a notice nailed to our cabin door. "Violation of HOA Code 3B, fine, $750. Failure to pay may result in lien." That was when I decided. Enough was enough. If Karen wanted a fight, she just picked the wrong dad. I stood on the porch, the notice still fluttering in the morning breeze, stapled right below the porch light like a threat nailed to a saloon door. The paper was cheap, the ink already bleeding from the dew, but the message was loud and clear. They thought they could find me into submission. I pulled it down slowly, folded it once, and slid it into my back pocket. Curtis's dog, Jasper, a mutt with one floppy ear and a loyalty that could break your heart, sat on the steps watching me. He didn't bark. He just tilted his head, sensing something had shifted. I walked inside, poured myself a mug of yesterday's coffee, and opened the old wooden roll-top desk in the corner of the den. The one my grandfather built. Inside was a binder thick, worn, and labeled with a single word in black marker. Whispering. For the last few years, I'd been quietly collecting every HOA newsletter, notice, and budget report that came through, not out of paranoia, just habit. I'd served on a zoning board back in the day and learned early that paper trails were gold when dealing with bureaucracy. I flipped to the most recent budget statement. The HOA was supposedly investing in shoreline preservation and security landscaping, but the numbers didn't add up. $32,000 spent on shoreline gravel. I'd seen the so-called project. It was 4 wheelbarrows of crushed limestone dumped behind the clubhouse. I pulled out my laptop and started cross-referencing vendors. A landscaping company listed on 2 invoices didn't exist. Not online, not in the state registry, not even in the yellowed local phone book we still kept in a kitchen drawer. The address for the company? It was a P.O. box in Karen Whitmore's name. I leaned back in the chair. This wasn't just overreach. This was fraud. By noon, I was in town. The county clerk's office was quiet, just the hum of a copier and the occasional shuffle of papers. I asked for public records on Whispering Pines, HOA, specifically annual filings, vendor contracts, and the articles of incorporation. The clerk, a woman named Leslie with horn-rimmed glasses and a no-nonsense expression, raised an eyebrow when she saw the name. "You a homeowner there?" she asked, flipping through a drawer. I nodded. "They served me with a fine for helping my son." "I've got questions." "Don't we all?" she muttered, pulling out a folder about the thickness of a paperback. "You're not the first to come looking." I took the folder to a table by the window and started reading. The Articles of Incorporation had been amended 3 years prior, right after Karen became board chair. The amendments gave the board power to issue fines without community vote, create emergency bylaws, and suspend voting rights of uncooperative members. That last clause was circled and highlighted in 3 different colors, likely by another poor soul who'd ticked her off. But the real gem was a series of vendor contracts signed off by acting treasurer Margaret Lister. Margaret had passed away last spring. All of those contracts were dated that summer. I copied everything, then drove straight to the sheriff's department. Not the local substation Karen had called, but the main county office. Deputy Peyton, the same guy who'd responded to the cabin, was behind the desk. He looked up from a report and gave a nod. "Back so soon?" "This time I'm not just unloading boxes," I said, setting the binder and the copied documents on the counter. "I think the HOA's been forging signatures and funneling money." He blinked, then opened the binder. His eyes narrowed as he flipped through the invoices. "You brought receipts." "Always do." He picked up the phone, asked for a detective, and within minutes, I was sitting in a back room with Detective Libby Cruz. She was sharp-eyed, quiet, and said very little as she read through the documents. "Anyone else seen this?" she finally asked. "Not yet." "Good. You didn't tell Karen you were coming here, didn't see the point in warning her." She nodded slowly. "You might want to consider lawyering up." "Not because you're in trouble, because this is going to get ugly." I left the station just as the sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the road. My phone buzzed 3 missed calls from a blocked number. I didn't bother listening to the voicemails. The next morning, I drove to the community center. It was one of those prefab buildings with beige siding and a sagging roof, but it had a bulletin board out front that every neighbor passed on the way to the lake. I pinned up a public notice. Emergency homeowners meeting Saturday, 5 p.m. Financial irregularities and board misconduct. Documents available for review. Attendance strongly encouraged. Below that, I taped a copy of the budget with the fake vendor circled in red and a sticky note with the words "Ask who signed this" in big block letters. By that evening, word had spread. Cars slowed as they passed the board. Some neighbors knocked on my door asking questions. I didn't give them details. Just told them to show up Saturday and bring anyone who still gave a damn about their property rights. Saturday came fast. And when 5 o'clock hit, the community center was packed. Retirees, young couples, even the guy who lived in the A-frame with solar panels and never spoke to anyone, all were there. People stood in the aisles, sat on folding chairs, perched on window sills. Karen hadn't shown. But 3 other HOA board members had Harold, Denise, and a guy named Vince who wore sunglasses indoors. I stood at the front, holding a stack of documents. "Thank you for coming. I know some of you had your doubts about how things were being handled. I'm here to show you that those doubts were justified. No theatrics, no raised voice, I just passed out the paperwork, fake vendors, forged contracts, illegally amended bylaws. And then, the kicker. A sworn affidavit from Margaret Lister's daughter confirming her mother had been in hospice the entire month the contracts were supposedly signed. Vince stood up first, trying to laugh it off. This doesn't prove anything. Mistakes happen in paperwork. That's not a mistake, I said, holding up the forged signature. That's fraud, and the sheriff's department agrees. They're opening an investigation. Harold looked like he'd swallowed a tack. Denise started whispering to someone in the back. Then the doors opened and in walked Detective Cruz in full uniform, flanked by 2 deputies. "Harold, Denise, Vincent, step outside," she said. "We need to ask you a few questions." Vince tried to argue. Harold just stared at the floor, but they followed her out. I turned back to the stunned room. "We've got a choice," I said. "We can wait for this to blow over or we can fix it. We've got enough signatures to call a vote. Revoke the current board, dissolve the HOA, rebuild from the ground up." People started nodding. A few clapped. Then someone yelled, "Let's take our neighborhood back." That night we did. We collected over 2/3 of the homeowners' votes, enough to fire every board member, freeze the HOA's accounts, and initiate dissolution proceedings. The next morning I walked out to the porch with a mug of fresh coffee. Jasper lay beside me, tail thumping lazily. The flag still fluttered, steady and proud. For the first time in a long while, the lake was quiet and it finally felt like home again. By Monday morning, Whispering Pines was humming with a kind of cautious relief. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact at mailbox clusters were now waving across yards, comparing notes, building something new from the wreckage of the old regime. But underneath the surface, there was tension like a storm had passed, but nobody was sure if the wind was truly gone or just circling back. I wasn't naive. Cutting off the head didn't kill the whole snake. There were still loose ends, financial ones, and more importantly, legal ones. The sheriff's office had launched a criminal probe, but as Detective Cruz warned me when she called that morning, things were about to get deeper than anyone expected. "There's something you need to see," she said. "Meet me at the county records annex." The annex was a squat concrete building behind the courthouse where old files went to be forgotten. Inside, she led me past rows of dusty cabinets to a locked room labeled HOA Corporate Archives Restricted. She unlocked the door, stepped aside, and let me in. On the metal table sat a banker's box. She opened it and carefully laid out its contents, a series of old leases, deeds, and maps, all bearing hand-corrected annotations. She tapped one document in particular. "This is a land use declaration filed 22 years ago. It's the original registration of Whispering Pines as a residential lakefront community." I scanned the page. "What's wrong with it?" She flipped it over and placed a second document beside it. It had the same parcel numbers, same signature, same date, but the language was different. The first declared the land residential. The second had a clause that allowed limited commercial development and easements for private enterprise. "That second one was never recorded with the county," she said. "But the HOA's internal files show it was used to secure funding from a shell investment group tied to Karen's husband, Doug Whitmore." My jaw tightened. "You're telling me they used fake records to get money out of the neighborhood? Not just money. Control." These fake documents were used to justify the HOA's authority over lots that should have never been under their jurisdiction. I stepped back from the table, the weight of it all sinking in. "How much money are we talking?" She hesitated. "Over 800,000. Laundered through 3 fake improvement projects over 5 years. The kicker? Residents paid into those projects through mandatory assessments." I stared at the ceiling. Good Lord. They also applied for a state grant based on these forged easements. "That's federal wire fraud." I rubbed my temples. "So now what? We're handing it off to the U.S. attorney. This isn't just a county issue anymore." By the time I left the annex, the sun was high and the sky was painfully blue, like it was mocking how deep the hole had become. I stopped at the general store to grab a drink and ran into Greg Taylor, a retired contractor who owned the cabin 2 doors down from mine. He'd kept his head down during the early drama, but it was clear from the tight set of his jaw that he wasn't staying silent anymore. "You know about the easements?" he asked without preamble. I nodded. "Just came from the annex. I checked my deed this morning. They never had rights over my shoreline, but they still charged me for that retaining wall project last year, said it was mandatory. You pay it," he scoffed. "Against my will, they threatened to file a lien." I paused. "Do you still have the invoice, every page, and the check copy? You thinking what I'm thinking?" Class action. Greg's eyes lit up. "Count me in." Over the next few days, momentum built fast. Word spread like wildfire. Residents who'd been too afraid or indifferent before were now digging through old records, receipts, and threatening letters. We set up a temporary committee, not another HOA, just a group of volunteers to gather evidence and coordinate with the county. Every day brought a new surprise, like the fact that Denise, the former treasurer, had been issuing checks to her cousin's consulting firm for auditing services that never existed. Or that Vince, the sunglasses guy, had quietly bought the lot across from the clubhouse for a fraction of market value thanks to a foreclosure orchestrated by the board when the elderly owner missed 2 maintenance payments while in the hospital. But the worst was what we found in the clubhouse basement. It was Greg who discovered it. He'd brought his tools to help remove the old filing cabinets so we could clear the space for community use. One of the cabinets was bolted to the wall. When he pried it free, the drywall behind it crumbled, revealing a hidden panel nailed into the studs. Inside, we found a locked safe. I called Cruz immediately. By the time she arrived with a warrant and a locksmith, half the committee had gathered outside, anxious and silent. The safe popped open with a sharp clank, and Cruz's face hardened the moment she saw the contents. Inside were 3 burner phones, a ledger with initials and dollar amounts, and a stack of manila envelopes labeled with residents' names. Mine included. Cruz pulled the ledger closer. "These are payoffs, and these envelopes contain surveillance photos, credit reports, even medical info. This is blackmail material." Greg stepped back. "They were spying on us. Looks like they ran background checks on anyone who opposed them, probably to shut down dissent quietly. Or make it go away entirely." I looked at my own envelope. Inside were photos of Curtis in uniform, pulled from public social media, but also a printout of his deployment orders, the same one I'd shown the deputy weeks ago. "How had they gotten that?" "This is disgusting," I muttered. Cruz nodded. "This just went from fraud to conspiracy." Within 48 hours, federal agents raided the Whitmore's home. Doug was arrested on charges of wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud the federal government, and misuse of grant funds. Karen had already fled to her sister's house in Vermont, but she was picked up at her rest stop by state troopers. They brought her back in cuffs. The news made local headlines. "Lake HOA scandal unravels fraud ring," read one. Another called it the quietest neighborhood with the loudest crimes. But for us, it wasn't about headlines. It was about healing. We held a town hall not in the community center, but outside under the pines, where the breeze off the lake could carry people's voices instead of stifling them in drywall. Nobody sat at a podium. We stood in a circle, passing the mic, each neighbor sharing their story, their frustration, and their vision for what came next. A vote was taken unanimous. Whispering Pines would never again form an HOA. Instead, we'd establish a cooperative, trust a volunteer group with no enforcement power, just a shared commitment to maintaining the land and supporting one another. No fines, no secret meetings, just neighbors helping neighbors. We used the recovered funds, what the investigators could trace and freeze, to fix the roads, replace the broken dock, and install solar-powered lights along the trails. The rest went into a community emergency fund, overseen by a rotating group of residents. That fall, Curtis returned from deployment. He stepped out of the car in full uniform, squinting up at the house, then smiled when he saw the new welcome sign carved into cedar. Whispering Pines, a community, not a corporation. He hugged me hard, then looked around. "Did you paint the cabin?" I laughed. "We repainted everything, even the rules." He looked out at the lake, then back at the porch where Jasper was curled up, tail thumping. "Feels different," he said. "Because it is," I told him. "We took it back." And we did. Not with noise or anger, but with evidence, unity, and the quiet force of people who'd had enough and refused to be silenced. Curtis stood on the back deck of the cabin, his boots still dusty from the base, arms folded as he looked out over the lake. The late September sun hit the water just right, casting long gold streaks clear across the surface. He hadn't said much since arriving, just soaked it all in the quiet, the view, the place that hadn't felt like his since before deployment. "You changed the railing," he finally said. "Yeah," I replied, tightening the last screw on the new bench I'd built from old cedar planks salvaged from the dock repair. "Greg's idea. Said the old one splintered too easy. We figured you deserved to come home to something solid." Curtis nodded without turning. "Feels strange. Like I missed a whole lifetime in 6 months." "You missed a lot," I said. "But you also came back just in time." He glanced over. "You going to tell me what happened to the HOA board, or are you planning to let the local news do it?" I set the drill down. "We'll talk inside." The living room was mostly the same worn rug, stone fireplace, a shelf of paperbacks nobody ever finished, but a few things had changed. I'd added a lockbox under the coffee table. Curtis noticed it right away. "Security upgrade." I opened it, handed him a folder. "Evidence. The kind that gets people indicted." He thumbed through the documents: bank transfers, wire logs, the ledger from the basement safe. He paused on one page. "This is the grant application. Looks like they forged half the supporting documents." "They didn't just forge them," I said. "They used your deployment status as justification for a community police subsidy. Claimed we had veterans in need of mental health surveillance after property disputes." Curtis's brow furrowed. "They used me. They used all of us." He dropped the folder on the table. "What now?" "Well," I said, "the feds are prosecuting Doug and Karen. The rest of the board cut plea deals, but there's one piece that's still open." He looked up. There was a second set of grant applications. Not filed yet, but drafted. They were planning to use eminent domain through county manipulation to seize the properties of anyone who defaulted on fines. Curtis leaned back on the couch, rubbing his temple. They were going to steal people's homes. They already started the paperwork. Curtis stared at the ceiling, and I worried about sandstorms. Outside, a pickup rumbled past the cabin, tires crunching over fresh gravel. A few kids from down the road rode by on bikes, waving as they passed. Curtis waved back absently. "You ever think about what would have happened if nobody pushed back?" he asked quietly. "Every day." He stood up and walked to the window. "I want to help however I can," I nodded. "There's a community committee, no titles. Just folks keeping things honest. Then I'm in." 2 days later, we gathered in the converted boathouse, now the neighborhood's new meeting spot. No podium, no gavel, just folding chairs and a dry erase board someone propped up against a canoe rack. Curtis stood at the front, hands in his pockets. He wasn't giving a speech, just talking straight. "I didn't fight overseas so people could get bullied in their own backyard," he said. "We need to make sure this never happens again, not here, not anywhere." Greg handed him a folder. "The state attorney's office is asking for community statements to support expanding criminal charges." Curtis flipped it open. "They're going after the law firm that backed the HOA," I answered. "They knew the documents were forged. They filed them anyway. Turns out they were getting kickbacks through a dummy escrow company." Curtis whistled low. "You sure this is a lakeside community and not a movie plot?" "Felt like one. Still does." By the end of the week, we had over 40 notarized statements. 3 attorneys volunteered pro bono to help residents recover stolen fees. The community fund paid for forensic accountants to trace what remained of the diverted money. We even got a letter from the state's Office of Consumer Protection, asking if we'd be willing to testify at a legislative session on HOA abuse. Curtis volunteered without hesitation. That hearing came a month later. We drove to the state capitol in his truck, still dented from a training incident back on base, still flying the same faded bumper sticker. Support those who serve. Inside the chamber, a panel of legislators sat behind polished wood desks. They looked tired. We weren't the first horror story they'd heard, but we might have been the most thorough. Curtis stood at the microphone and laid it out, no emotion, no spin. Just facts. What the HOA had done, how they used his service, how they turned a peaceful lake cabin into a surveillance target. When he finished, the room was silent. Then a senator leaned forward. "Do you believe HOAs should be abolished?" Curtis didn't flinch. "I believe they should be accountable. If they can't operate without fear, without fraud, and without preying on people who can't fight back, then yes. They should be abolished." The panel voted unanimously to draft new legislation, the Homeowner Protection Act. It would require all HOAs in the state to undergo annual independent audits, restrict fine authority, and prohibit enforcement without judicial oversight. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Back at the lake, the changes were already visible. The old clubhouse was turned into a volunteer-run rec center. No dues, just a donation box and a sign-up sheet. Kids ran lemonade stands on weekends. Retirees taught gardening workshops. Curtis started a community safety patrol, not law enforcement. Just neighbors keeping an eye out for each other. One afternoon, as we repaired the trail bridge that had rotted through during the years of HOA neglect, Curtis paused with a hammer in hand. "You realize we didn't just stop them, right?" he said. I looked up from the support beam. "What do you mean? We built something better, not just here, but maybe everywhere this story gets told." I smiled. "Funny, I thought I was the one teaching you things," he chuckled. "You are. But I'm still deploying again in the spring. Someone's got to keep this place from turning into a resort while I'm gone." "Don't worry," I said. "We've got it covered." That evening, we sat on the dock, me, Curtis, Jasper curled up between us. The water was still, the wind light. Across the lake, a family lit a fire pit, their laughter floating over the darkening water. Curtis leaned back against a post. "Think we'll ever forget all this?" "No," I said, "and we shouldn't." "Good." Above us, the sky turned deep blue, stars blinking into place one by one. And for the first time since it all began, there was nothing left to fix. Nothing left to fight. Just peace, the kind you earn when you stand your ground, no matter how small the patch of earth you're standing on.